Hi guys, it's Mrs. Chappie. Welcome to U.S. History. We are on week 3 of our remote learning, quarantine, shelter in place, uh, COVID-19, coronavirus learning. So I'm glad that you're here with me. We are going to just keep going forward with this. So U.S. History, what are we going to do today on our 3rd week? This would be our 9th week of class, and if you are following along on the syllabus, we're talking very specifically over this week and next week about details of the Civil War, which we have spent this entire semester learning about the differences between the North and the South, the East and the West, how our country developed, and how that is going to specifically lead right into this problem of the Civil War. So if we were together in class, we would be working on a project out of your binder. So in your binder, there's lots of different worksheets and such, but there are a series that go together that teach you and tell you about events during the Civil War, and we would be working on those in class. So when we meet together, I'll go over each of the worksheets with you that you may choose to do at home because we would have been doing them in class. If not, you can listen to just, me spieling my brilliance and hearing a little bit about history. So I'm going to screen share with you. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to screen share with you. Just a second. I thought of something I wanted to say. I'm going to share that with you, and you can follow along. I'm going to email or include on the website what's a PowerPoint outline. So I don't often do this with my homeschool students like you guys because we're doing so much hands-on project-based, but I think this might be really good for you guys to give it a shot. It is an outline of everything I'm talking about. And what you do is you fill in the missing words. Some of my older students have done this a couple of times with me because it's an important skill as you're getting ready for high school. My younger students, you're going, why do I want to do that? I'm not near high school. I know you're not, but it's still something that might be good for you to try practicing. It's the ability to follow along with what your teacher is teaching, that's me, and to fill in missing words in a outline. You don't have to take the whole notes yourself. Some of my students are excellent note takers. Claire, I'm thinking of you because you are an excellent note taker. But you just fill in the missing words. And this is a great time to practice it because you have a video. You can hit stop at any time and look and think what word goes in that spot, and you can insert it in there. So I think that would be really good for you all to practice. If you do it, I'd love to hear how it went. Send me an email or a text. Let me know how it was because I'm kind of curious because we don't do that a lot. In the past, in other classes, I've taught exclusively that way. And it's a really strong way to learn because you're having to listen, you're having to look, and you're having to write. And so it's getting that information into your noggin a whole bunch of different ways. So I'm hoping you try that. As I turn on the PowerPoint, you'll see, oh, this is the notes that Mrs. Chappie is talking about, and it will make some sense to you. So give that a shot. Let me know how it works. I'm hoping it works well. So I'm sharing my screen. I'm hitting screen share, and I'm going to the Civil War, and we're just going to go ahead and start this just as if we were in class, although that went really well. Oftentimes I try to screen share stuff, and it takes me forever. So we're going to kind of march through this. Or march, get it? I made a joke, sort of, and take a look at what was happening in our country. So this is a map. You know how I feel about maps. This gives us an overview of where we stand at this point in history. We've spent so much time looking at this map and seeing how America grew that you now can see as the Civil War begins how there's this very clear divide. And you have a worksheet in your binder that I also put on your parents' homework assignment where I really, really encourage you to go ahead and color it in. Color in the Union States blue and the Confederate States gray, and you can see that there's a clear divide based on the geography, based on the economy, based on the lifestyle of the people in these different areas. So if you need to pause it and color it, that's great. Otherwise, we'll just keep chitty-chatting along here. So as we're entering into this war, How does it start? Well, it starts with an attack on a fort. And this happened on April 12th, 1862. And if you listen to that song, the one that we did last week, the last line of that song is the bomb at Fort Sumter started the war. It was a fort that was on an island in a harbor. I had the privilege of going there and visiting it last summer, which was super exciting. It was on my bucket list of things that I wanted to do in my lifetime. And out in the harbor is this island. And on the island, there is this fort. And what had happened was the Southern fleet attacked it launched cannon fire at the fort, and it wasn't like one bomb blew up, but it was this attack on it that was officially the beginning of the war. And because the South had attacked a Union fort, a Northern fort, an American fort, Lincoln instantly asked for volunteers to come forward to help preserve the Union. The South had said, we're seceding, which means they're leaving, and they had fired a shot. And so at that point, it was time for Abraham Lincoln of the Union to get volunteers to come forward. Now, when the South seceded, when they left, they had to get their very own leader, and they elected this man, Jefferson Davis, to be the president of the Confederate States, to be the president of the South. And Jefferson Davis is also preparing for war. He was the newly elected president, and he called for volunteers to defend the South. So both sides are raising armies. That means that this war is going to happen. We've had the firing on a fort, we've had the secession, and we've had newly elected leaders. So we have Lincoln on the north and Jefferson on the south. That's an illustration of this fort that's on an island, Fort Sumter. And here's another illustration of the bombs or the cannon firing onto this fort. Okay, so when we start to look at this war between the North and the South, you know how I like to look at all the reasons behind everything so much more than tell me what happened. I want to know why it happened. And so I want you to understand what made the North strong and what problems the North had. You already know what the economy was like, that it was more industrial, that it was built on factories, that it wasn't great for growing large-scale crops. You've learned all of that. So how is that going to translate into making the North successful or not successful in the war? Well, first of all, the difference between the North and the South is there were a lot more people up in the North. They had 22 million people. The South, on the other side, only had about 9 million. So that's going to make a big difference. So I'd ask you, if you were with me, who do you think has an advantage just based on the number of people? And of course, you'd look at that and go, Mrs. Chappie, it's by far the North. So that is a strength that the North has. They have more people. They also have more money. The banks are in the North, and this is where the economy was based on factories. So they have this technological advantage, meaning that they can build things that the South may not be able to. 90% of the nation's manufacturing is up north. And the geography was such that in the north, they had these small farms that could feed their armies. Now in the south, we know they had more farming, but these were farms that grew things that were called cash crops, things that are making them money, like cotton, like indigo, like tobacco. And it wasn't stuff that people are going to eat. Now a huge plantation that's growing tons and tons of cotton is going to be important to the South's economy, but people aren't going to go eat cotton for dinner. So the North had this advantage in that they could provide food for their troops. I hope that kind of makes a little bit of sense. And also in the North, they had all of the minerals and things that they needed to produce goods, things like iron and coal and copper and gold. And the North controlled the seas. We had talked about in the past, you and I, in our class, I know we've had a lot of discussion about that in the North is where they built boats, where they had a lot of lumber industry that then were used for boats, that in the North, They had inlets and bays that were a place where ships could go. And because of that, they had this control of the oceans, controls of the seas, because that's where their boat manufacturing and their harbors and so on were. Also in the north, we talked about the laying of railroad tracks and the creation of canals and transportation systems. And those were more developed up in the north. They had 21,000 miles of tracks, and they did that because that's where goods were manufactured and where they needed to transport stuff and where most of the population was. So they're going to have a distinct advantage by having a lot more railroad tracks up in the north. Their biggest weakness in the north is they were lacking military leadership. When the South seceded, when the South left the Union, they took with them the best and the brightest in the military world. 1/3 of the military's, where do I put me? Here we go. 1/3 of the military leadership resigned from the Union and went to the South. They felt very passionate and very connected to their communities, and so they just up and left. There were great military leaders who were opposed to slavery, who were opposed to secession, but yet they were so connected to their states that they left the Union and went and stood by their states. So today, when I talk to people, I would say, are you an American or are you a Californian first? Which is more important to you? And a lot of people move a lot today in our country. You live in Texas for a while, then you live in California, and then maybe you move to Colorado. And so generally, and we'll talk about this when we're together on Thursday, generally people connect more with the state, or pardon me, more with the entire country than they do with their come on, Mrs. Chappie, their specific state. They have more of a connection to the country. Whereas historically, during this period, during the Civil War, the connection was more closely to their state. Okay, what else do I have for you? So we talked about that. Those are being the strengths and weaknesses of the North. Now let's talk a little bit about the South and see what makes the South strong and what the South's problems are. Now, one of the South's strengths were that it would be hard for the North to invade and conquer them. Geographically, when we looked at the map, the South was a big area, and in order to stop the South, the North would have to go there and conquer them, and so that's to the South's advantage. The size of the South makes that a huge task. Now, another thing that was to the advantage or a strength of the South is the South had this belief that they were defending liberty. They were defending their homes, they were defending their traditions, they were defending their states' rights to decide what they wanted to do. Now, the main issue, of course, was what they were going to do with the issue of slavery, but they believed that they had the right to make that decision for themselves. And so they had this real strong conviction in what they were fighting for. Now, the North, because of things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, because of the abolitionist movement, they believed that slavery was wrong, but did they believe it was wrong more than the South believed that they had the right to decide for themselves? The South probably believed a little bit more. So we put that on the strength of the South side. Their greatest strength was their military leadership. We said that was the weakness of the North. The South had the best and the brightest and the most wonderful military leaders, particularly a guy named Robert E. Lee. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had asked Robert E. Lee, will you come be the Union's head of their military? Will you run everything for me and be my right-hand guy? And Robert E. Lee actually said no. And he went back to his home state of Virginia. He did not think slavery was a good idea. He did not think it was a good idea for states to secede. And therefore, Abraham Lincoln tapped him and said, hey, I want you to be in charge. But even though he agreed with Lincoln on all these principles, he more cared about his home state. And so he left and he went back to Virginia. he couldn't fight against Virginia. There was no way he thought he could do that. And he became the commander and chief of the Confederate forces. All right, there's a nice picture of our Robert E. Lee right there. By all accounts, although he was fighting on the wrong side, we would say, of history, because he was fighting to allow states to allow slavery, and we know slavery is wrong, but by all other accounts, he was not a bad person. I mean, he even thought slavery was wrong, even though he fought for it. In your notebook, you should have some of this, the Confederate flag. And the Confederate flag, it's worth stopping for a second, camping on this Confederate flag, particularly for my older grades. My younger grades, you're saying, Mrs. Chappie, you're doing it again, you're talking to the big kids. Yeah, well, you get to listen to all this fun. The Confederate flag is an interesting symbol throughout American history. For a long period of time, up until almost pretty recently, it was used as a symbol of the ability to make your own decisions. It was in popular TV shows. I grew up with a TV show called The Dukes of Hazzard. They had a car that had the Confederate flag on it. You often saw it. A lot of people had it in their yards, particularly in the South, not so much, in California, because this doesn't have to do with California history. But it was used as a symbol of self-determination, that the states had the right to decide what rules they would and would not make and what rules they would and would not follow. And so it was, sometimes it's called the rebel flag, because they're rebelling against a strong government telling them what to do. And for, a long period of time, over 100 years, that's what that flag stood for. Well, in real recent history, the history that you guys are growing up in not the history that I was raised in, so post my college time, a lot of historians have looked back at this flag and said, yeah, it did stand for what those people were using it for, but it also stood for promoting slavery. And it also stood for the ideas that we all agree are wrong as Americans. I have never met anyone who thinks that slavery is defensible, or that slavery is an okay thing, or that slavery was a good part of American history, because it's like we talked last week, it's morally wrong and you cannot defend that. And so modernly, in just literally the last couple of years, people now look at that flag and say that flag symbolizes hate and treatment of people that are in a way that is unacceptable, and it symbolizes that slavery is a good thing. And so that flag now is just an awful, awful sign. And so it has changed how people look at that flag, and it is causing right now a lot of conflict and a lot of debate and a lot of issues. There are some colleges that say you can't put that up in your room because it symbolizes pro-slavery. There's other colleges that say you're welcome to put whatever you want in your room because we're a free country and you're allowed to express yourself. There are some people that still will have that flag on their car because they're proud of their Southern heritage. There are other people that say if you put that on your car, you are racist and an awful person. So I'm just mentioning this to my older students so that you're aware of that. I think what's really important is you never want to do anything that's going to upset or hurt someone else. And so now that you know that that would upset or hurt someone else by displaying or celebrating that, it's something you may not want to do. So you always want to be thinking, how do my actions affect other people? And so when we look at historic symbols like this, I want you to be aware of that. If we were together in class, I have a Confederate flag. I would bring it in so that you could look at it and see what it looked like. You have in your worksheets some flags because it's a historic symbol that I want you to recognize that it was the Confederate States. But I also want you to be very much aware that it is becoming a controversial symbol and that you don't want to use it or recognize it inappropriately, because slavery is clearly wrong, and anyone who would support slavery would be wrong. Does that kind of make sense? I'm rambling. I wish you guys were here with me. So hard when you're not here. So we're talking about strengths and weaknesses, and what weaknesses do you think the South had? Well, based on what we've already talked about, we know that their economy was not as strong as the North. The North had that manufacturing and that industry. In the South, their economy didn't have the money to support a super long war. So if there was going to be a war, it better be over quickly. They didn't have the factories to make the guns or other military supplies that they would need. And they had those transportation problems because they didn't have as many railroads. They didn't have that infrastructure for delivering goods. We call that logistics. They had logistical problems. The supplies had to be carried by wagons. And while the South was very wealthy, most of their wealth was in land and in enslaved people. And so they didn't have the cash available to pay for the war. So just looking at this, you start to see, okay, what does it look like? Which side has the advantage? Now, there's always an advantage to being morally right, to being fighting for something that is correct, and eliminating slavery is obviously going to be correct. And so the North has that advantage. In the South, they started using their own money, and they printed their own money. And by printing your own money, you print as much as you want. Then you have this thing called inflation, and then the money is worth less. So if everybody had $1 and milk cost $1, that would be the value of milk. Now, if you printed more money and now everybody is given $10, is milk going to still only be $1? Or if everyone has $10 each, milk's now going to be $10. So that's inflation from printing money. My older 8th grade students, it's called quantitative easing, and it happens today. A lot of it led to World War II in the Weimar Republic, problems with Venezuela today, and we'll see what happens in America in the future. So let's talk right now, here I'll put myself right between those, about these two leaders. They look somewhat similar, Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln, the North and the South. Oh, I'm looking at this picture of Abraham Lincoln, and I look right above me on my wall. I have this exact same picture on my wall. I had no idea, because I've never looked at this PowerPoint in my office at the same time. Abraham Lincoln, what do we know about him as a leader? His firm belief, in addition to believing slavery was wrong, he believed that the Union, the connection of the states, was perpetual. That means that it should never be broken. And that means that states don't have a right to decide, I'm going to leave the Union. And that exists today. California cannot decide that they are going to be their very own country and leave our union. California can't do that. Neither could Texas. Texas can't go be its own country right now. Abraham Lincoln, he was born in Kentucky. He was born to a poor family. He lived in a one-room cabin. His mother died when he was very young. His father remarried. He had a great relationship with his new stepmom. He didn't have a lot of formal schooling. By all accounts, I think I read recently that he went to formal school for about a year. Most of his schooling was done just by ravenously reading. The man loved to read. He would walk for miles to get books, to be able to read about them. He read everything that he could. When he was 21, he had moved to the state of Illinois. There he became a lawyer. He read books, learned, you could self-teach yourself things. Actually, today, becoming a lawyer is one of the few things you can technically do without going to college. If you are studying under a lawyer and you register with the Bar Association and say, I am studying to be a lawyer, and you progress along and then pass a test, you could be a lawyer without ever going to law school. Fun fact, I do not know anyone who has ever done that, although one of the Kardashians is trying. I've read. Don't know which one. I don't know much about them. Fun fact, Abraham Lincoln, super tall. Another fun fact, he was the first president to actually have a beard. Another fun fact, he was the first president to be born out of the original colonies. And there we have Abraham Lincoln. Talk about Jefferson Davis. Pretty impressive that he was able to take 11 stubborn independent states in the South and kind of unite them into that Confederacy. He was born in Kentucky. He grew up on a plantation in Mississippi. He attended the military academy at West Point up in New York, which would be in the Union in the North. He fought in the Mexican War. He believed strongly in states' rights, and he was not a huge politician. His first White House, another thing that I did this summer on my Great American Road Trip is we went and saw Jefferson Davis's first White House, which was kind of funny. There we got him with his Confederate flag. Okay, so when the war starts, how are these people going to fight the war? Now you guys, again, you're probably going, why are you telling us all this stuff, Mrs. Chappie? Just tell us what happened. I like the reasons behind stuff. I like to dig deep and understand why things happened, because then we can learn from them and in the future not make mistakes or do things that worked and understand that. When you just say, memorize a date and tell me who won a battle, I don't care so much about that. I care more about reasons behind things. So let's talk about the war strategy for the Union, the North. What were they going to do? Well, they had this total war plan. They were going to attack the South by land and by sea and to totally crush them. They had this idea that if they went around the South and squeezed it in, oh, I can do that with my head, squeezed it in. They called it the Anaconda Plan, that they would cut off supplies to the South and then ultimately prevail. So they were going to cut off the trade, that's the supplies. They worked on dividing the Confederacy into sections by cutting off routes to them. They wanted the South to not be able to support one another in their various regions. And the goal was if they captured Richmond, Virginia, then that could become their capital there. That's that Anaconda Plan that I told you that resembled the crushing death grip of an anaconda snake coming around it and stopping it. Ah, how cool is that? This is that Anaconda Plan. Let's cut everything off by land, cut everything off by sea, and control that. There we have another example of that. There's a famous movie that used to be very popular. Again, it's becoming controversial, called Gone with the Wind. And it's about the Southern plantation owners and their experience. It kind of glorifies them during the Civil War. And there's a famous scene in that where the main character, her name's Scarlett O'Hara, she is really into her fancy dresses and she loves wearing her dresses. And she always has to have a brand new dress for every single event that she goes to. And she can't get material or a dress because this Anaconda Plan has stopped all trade and everything happening, and she's kind of isolated. Well, she's not going to go without a new dress. So in the movie, they actually take the curtains off of the windows in the house, and they use those curtains to make her a velvet green dress because the Anaconda Plan had stopped the supplies. They don't refer to it as the Anaconda Plan, and they don't say that had what was happening, but in the movie, historically, that is what they were trying to depict, is that she couldn't get a dress. Poor gal. I'm going to not talk about a lot of battles, but there are a couple I want you to maybe sound familiar as you move on to your next grade. If you're in 4th, 5th grade, when you hear this again in 8th grade, it'll go, oh, kind of familiar. If you're in 7th, 8th grade and you hear this again in high school, it will sound kind of familiar. So the Battle of Bull Run, this is where there were soldiers outside they took the soldiers and they marched from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, Virginia, which isn't, super far. It is somewhere that you could march to. And the Northerners who were marching from Washington, D.C. to Virginia are thinking, oh, this is going to be an easy war. This is going to be over super soon. We can win it in a single battle. We're going to attack that capital in Richmond, Virginia. It'll be super easy and the war will be over. In fact, that movie I was just telling you about, Gone with the Wind, in Gone with the Wind, there's a scene where they're all heading off to battle and they grab their guns and they're like, bye, Mom, I'll be right back. War's going to be over in just a minute. And they're like having a barbecue and they think they're going to run off to battle and the war will be over in, one quick confrontation and it will all be done. Well, that's not what ended up happening. The soldiers were singing and cheering as they marched off, and they're expecting it to be over instantly. Well, they get there, and there's an actual fight. I mean, it wasn't a simple little thing. This is an illustration of it. It's quite interesting. You know how we like to look at paintings in this class. You can see the American flag on the ground, very symbolic of the Union, who thought this was going to go down super easy. It was going to be right over instantly. That no, the Union's flag is on the ground. It's going to be a longer, drawn out process than they expected. And one of the reasons that it did not go is this gal, Rose Greenhow. She was a widow, and she was what's called a socialite, a kind of a social leader in Washington, D.C. And she supported the South, but she was going to parties and interacting with a lot of the leadership up in Washington, D.C. Of the Union. And so she knew about this plan to march down to Richmond. And because she knew it, she was basically a spy, and she warned the Southern leaders about this plan. And when she was able to warn them, they knew about it. They knew about the planned attack, and they could prepare for it. That's a picture of her. So the two armies meet at a creek, and the creek was called Bull Run. That's why we call it the Battle of Bull Run. This is where the armies intersected, was at this well-known creek. And the general and his regiment of Virginians refused to give way, and they stood there. And they knew that the Union Army was coming, and they said, look, there's there's Jackson not moving like a stone wall. And so he got this nickname called Stonewall Jackson. Look, there's Jackson with the Virginians standing like a stone wall. And the rebels held their lines. The Union forces charged. It was super unnerving to hear this. And when the two sides converge and conflict, the Union troops end up retreating all the way back to Washington. They weren't experienced, they weren't prepared, and this became what we call a smashing victory for the South, where no one thought it would go on like this. The South stood their ground, even though we just went through that list of advantages and disadvantages. The South didn't have the supplies, didn't have the money, didn't have the people, but they had the experienced leaders. And so you see that in this first battle where the South is prevailing. And because of this, the North is like, oh dear, this is going to be a long war. They had to prepare for it to last. There's Stonewall Jackson. And the last thing I want to talk about today while we're together is women's roles within the war. Wives and women supported their families. They stayed behind. They ran farms. They ran businesses. They were kind of what we call the backbone of all this. Oftentimes when you study history and you study wars, you're talking about the great men that were leaders. But I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about the contributions of the women. They were spies, they were guides, they were messengers. They served within the military doing these important roles. And we just saw the impact of one spy in Washington, didn't we? They also volunteered to help sick and wounded soldiers. There was a woman, Dorothea Dix, who is one that Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix are usually who we think about as the main strong women who changed the course of the war through their actions. And Dorothea Dix, she worked particularly with mentally ill people, and she set up different Army nursing services because she had all of this experience that she had by taking care of mentally ill. So she got put in charge of the Union Army's nursing service. And she came up with all of these rules about volunteers. And they're kind of funny for us to look at now. She said, well, first of all, we want all of our volunteers to be sturdy. We need them to be over 30 years old. We want our volunteers to be plain in appearance. You can't be too pretty of a volunteer. And you have to be physically strong and willing, she said, to do unpleasant work. Being a nurse in the middle of a war could be very, very unpleasant. It could be very messy and traumatizing. And so she made sure that her volunteers were strong and could do that unpleasant work. There's a picture of her. And then Clara Barton, she was known as the angel of the battlefield. She followed the Union armies literally into battle. She was the founder of the American Red Cross. And there we have a picture of her. And I think I'm going to go ahead and stop right here. We're going to come back to this at a later date. The later date being next week, right? Not that far away. Okay. It seems like I hope it's been recording okay. I'm looking at myself right now for the first time and I'm looking kind of weird, but hopefully it's all going good. So the whole purpose of that lecture was to give you some of the background understanding of the Civil War. The worksheets that we have in our notebook that we would be working on together are more facts and figures of this date this happened, that date that happened. There's some great coloring sheets in there where you can color the what do you call it? The uniforms of the Union and the Confederate soldiers and such. So I hope that you enjoy that. I hope everyone is staying happy and healthy and safe. I look forward to seeing you guys on Thursday. I have to tell you, I love Thursdays, seeing all of your faces. It really warms my heart, so I'm really looking forward to that. And I think that's all I have to say for today. So you guys have a super, super great week, and I will see you guys later. Bye, y'all.